So here we have our matte window cut and ready to go. And now we need to place our design on the board for painting. The great thing about this particular matte cutting technique or procedure is that it doesn't involve measuring. And the other great thing is that before you even start painting, you have your matte cut. Matte cutting can be a sort of difficult last step in a process, especially if you're tired or you finish painting late at night. And you really do need a very steady hand when you cut a matte. So that's what's really great about this technique. So what you want to do is line up your boards, the white one and the black one, and then simply take a pencil and in those four corners of the matte window you just cut, just place a small pencil dot. And you can see on here where the edges of the matte window are going to fall. And so then what you do is you take your original design, and I can see here are the windows where the matte will line up, and I line those up again on this interior line because this indicates where the matte window goes. This exterior line represents that extra area that we're going to provide, just to prevent any issues. So then what I would tell you to do is once this is lined up, tape down your design and then transfer it. If you remember the transfer paper that we used on the focal point design, exact same technique onto the cold press board. This is basically carbon paper. There's a coating of graphite on there. So you put the dark side down, and then you can easily transfer your design right onto the board for painting. So you would then paint the design and execute it. And then the final step is going to be how to attach the matte to the board and the two cover flaps onto the assembly as well. So here you can see we have our cut matte, and this represents your finished painted design, whichever project it might be. You can see here for the purposes of the demo, I've added this pencil line just so you can see where the design would actually be sitting on the board as we go through this next step. So the next thing we want to do is to attach the matte onto the project. So this is the front of the matte, and again remember the back has all these pencil lines which we use to cut and place the window. So align the two top edges of the matte board and the illustration board and the matte board. And then you're going to run a single piece of tape along here so it creates a simple hinge so that the project can be looked at without the matte as well. Now this tape is slightly transparent, and so you should be able to pretty much get half black, half white under that tape. Provide a little bit of extra tape, which we will now trim off with the ruler. Again, neatness and presentation quality are very important on these assignments and on all of our assignments. So first I will come up here and cut this edge off. Just lightly score it. You don't need to apply a lot of pressure when cutting tape. And then the other edge. Again, I'm trying to protect the area on the other side of the ruler. Okay, and so that is a hinged matte. So notice how it opens and closes. And that shows us again where our design will be. And this is actually a pretty important thing to show. Where I put that pencil line at first, if you see over here on the right lower corner, notice how that's the edge of my design. Now, if I had not provided an extra little bit of bleed area for painting, there would be a little white ribbon showing up on the outside of the paint, between the matte window and the painting. So providing that little bit of extra area, which we discussed earlier, is very important because it really prevents issues like this from, detracting from the overall grade or presentation quality. So our next step is to attach the two cover flaps, which you will see attach right onto the back of the board very easily. Here we have a large piece of tracing paper or vellum paper as specified on the supply list. And this is going to be the first flap in our cover flapping of the design project. So just to reiterate, you have your hinged mat where the mat is already attached onto the board with a single piece of tape along that top edge. Then what you want to do is figure out how large the tracing paper flap needs to be. You want it to be a little bit larger than the project, not a lot larger, not a half an inch or a quarter inch, just a hair. You can see here along this left edge how there's just a little bit of an extra flap there. Now what I would advise along this bottom edge, you could put a pencil mark here, but actually sometimes when you're doing precision cutting or presentation, you can also indicate where you want to cut with a knife. If you see here, I put a little cut right there, and that's really just as easy to see as a pencil mark, and it's much, much neater. So use the knife here and there to also indicate where you want to cut. So what I will do now, though, is I am going to measure this and transfer that measurement up to the top edge so I can be sure to get a nice straight cut along this side. So that's just under 10 1/4 inches. So I will transfer that measurement up to this top edge. And again, I will use my knife. And I will then connect those two spots with my ruler. Again, this ruler is just large enough for this paper. If you have a larger ruler around the house or a T-square, you might want to use it. Okay, so here we have our matted design project. Now to add the tracing paper flap, then you want to actually turn the whole thing over. Make sure that the design is centered, so there's a little bit of that extra paper on the left, right, and bottom. And then what we're going to do is just simply, we're going to fold this over and affix a single piece of tape along there. I'm preparing my tape first. Set it over here, because what I want to do is just lightly crease this paper for where I want it to go, just so that it's a little bit easier to tape in the next step. Now, if you're the type who has oily hands or your hands get dirty, do wash your hands throughout this procedure, because you don't want to get smudges on this final stage of the presentation. Now these edges are okay because we're actually going to trim this whole thing in just a few moments so that it looks even neater on the back. So here what I've done is I have cut the black exterior cover flap to size already, and you can see here along the edge that the tracing paper flap or vellum flap is slightly larger than the project, and then the black cover flap is slightly larger than the tracing paper. So we're going to attach it in the same way we attached the tracing paper flap, by folding the top over and then affixing a single piece of tape along the edge. And I am going to crease it now before I bring the tape over. Make it a little easier. Single piece of tape. Try to keep it straight and neat. I'm using my pinkies because actually there's quite a bit of black on my fingers just from creasing the paper right there. Okay, so then we're ready for our final step in the presentation, which is just to slightly angle these two just so it's neater and more presentable. So what I would tell you to do is our board is 10 inches wide. Just measure in maybe 2 inches on each side. You could use a 30, 60, 90 triangle with the different angles if you want to be precise. However, doing it this way, just measuring in 2 inches on either side is just as good. Now again, I did that with a knife, and you might not be able to see the mark on camera. It's very small, but I can definitely see it with my naked eye. So I'm just going to move this toward me a little bit for the cutting. So I line it up to the corner. There's my knife mark. Now be careful when you're cutting up around here, because you don't want to cut through to the front of the flap. You just want to make sure that the back separates, because then we can always, finesse and correct the corner in a moment. So let's just see how that came out so far. Good. So I'm going to correct this in just a moment. Let me just cut it off for now. There we go. We'll clean that up in just a second. And the tracing paper. So we're going to repeat that process over on this side. If the tape pulls a little bit of the board up on the back, that's not a huge issue. But do make sure it stays neat overall. And so here is my mark that I'm cutting to. So the two sides match. Okay, and the paper. Okay. Okay, so then if you do want to clean up these little corners, what I would tell you to do would be to just open the whole project like this, and then just clean it up. Get rid of that little fuzz that was along there. And this edge looks pretty good. So that is pretty much how you do it in a nutshell. Now, one other thing, when you do post your work online of these finished projects, they don't need to be cover flapped or matted in the scan. But when you send them in the final portfolio, this is how they must be presented. I would recommend that you mat and cover flap them as you do them, instead of doing them all before you send the final portfolio, because the more you do it, the better practice you'll get with the whole procedure. So just to reiterate, the final design is there. There's a tracing paper flap, then there's an exterior cover flap, and on the back, add your name and your ID number. And again, you might also affix your roughs onto the back in an envelope. That is all covered also in the slideshow and in the presentation requirements.